Thank you, Keith. Welcome, everybody, particularly to those of you joining us from outside the UK. Also, a particular welcome to Antonia Fraser, who I can see is on the call, who very kindly gave me and Harry Mount an interview about her recollections of AP and Lady Violet. If you've not seen it, I've got the transcript of that interview and a recording of it, so let me know if you want to see that. It's my pleasure to introduce Colin Donald, who's our speaker this evening. Speaking to us from Stirling in Scotland. Colin is a trustee of the Society and has presented before at our conferences, most recently at Oxford, where he presented a paper on Mona Templar and talking about AP's approach to her as an artist model and to portraiture in general. So tonight, Colin's going to be talking to us about AP and Dickens. So over to you, Colin.
Great. Thank you very much. First of all, thank you so much, Paul, for that introduction, and thank you very much for inviting me back to speak in your virtual conference season. This is the fourth time I've spoken, actually, and on each occasion, I'm hoping you can all see my first slide there. Yeah. On each occasion, I've sort of come at the Anthony Powell from different directions. Really, this is my latest attempt to get off my chest what I think is special about Anthony Powell, and why I think that is necessary is that when I've been sort of a huge fan of Powell for 35 years now, which is a very long time to be fascinated by an author. And I worry away at the question of why that is and what is it that I consider special about him. And this time I wanted to do it slightly obliquely through the mirror of a great predecessor in the English novel, Charles Dickens. A writer for whom Powell had fairly complicated feelings, I would say, and to try and isolate the things that Powell learned from Dickens. There are positive and negative things, of course. This time I'm going to focus on what might seem like the more negative things, and an awful lot more to say about the things that Powell learned from Dickens. And probably there are people a lot more learned in the works of Dickens who would be better placed to do that. But I'm basing this talk on my reading of all the Dickens references in Powell's work, which I surveyed last year, and I'm trying to draw some conclusions from that. So the structure of this is, and I'll try to keep to time, is I'm going to, after a little bit of introduction, I'm going to talk about the things that Powell, the issues that Powell had with Dickens, and to try and sort of weigh them up and to see how they stand up. And in the course of that, I go into a little bit more detail about what I am assuming were Powell's sort of beefs with Dickens and the things that he learned from his example. And then I'm going to go on to the slightly pseudo-scientific analysis of two characters, or rather the construction of two characters. These are Private Bracey, the soldier servant in The Kindly Ones, in Anthony Powell's The Kindly Ones, and the character Phil Squad, the kind of slightly feral assistant in Sergeant George's shooting gallery in Charles Dickens's Bleak House. And they have some points of comparison, but the point of comparing them is fairly apples and pears, totally different types of novel, of course, is to look at the way that the characters were constructed and try and infer some things about Powell's sort of method of constructing a character from that. So I should start, as I do in my paper, which reminds me, Keith has very kindly circulated a draft, and I stress draft paper on which this talk is based. And I put it out there really to invite comment and improvements, really. I can only see things that need improving at the moment. I'd really like to sort of crowdsource a better version of that, I hope, with a view to publishing it somewhere in a society newsletter. I'm going to start by recalling a conversation that Anthony Powell had with the novelist C.P. Snow back. It was in 1977 when they were sort of stuck together in an aeroplane, and Powell asked if Snow was a Dickensian, and Snow said that, well, he wasn't really, but he would struggle to think of another author who was sort of second to Shakespeare in the English pantheon. And this struck me as it's a slightly sort of grudging respect for Dickens that Powell and C.P. Snow shared, and I wanted to sort of analyze why. But I should say that in Powell's life, as far as we know, Dickens held a very important place, and we know that because Anthony Powell's sons have told me that Dickens was the author whom their father read to them most, and those of us who have read Dickens to their children know what an investment of time and energy that takes on behalf of the speaker and the listener. And the fact that Dickens was sort of high on the reading list at the Chantry tells us a lot. The novels were Tale of Two Cities, Pickwick Papers, Christmas Carol, and these were from a set of Dickens that has pride of place on the Chantry bookshelf near in the drawing room near the fireplace. So we know that that Powell held a very high place Dickens held a high place in Powell's pantheon. There's a very important quotation that appears in one of Anthony Powell's critical essays, in which he talks about Dickens as the product of a terrifically powerful imagination, geared to many strong characteristics, not necessarily those of a novelist. Well, I find this very interesting. What he seems to be saying is that Dickens was a sort of marvelously a vivid writer and with this amazing imagination, but his skills weren't necessarily those of a novelist, which is what, of course, we think of him as. And it slightly makes me wonder as to what those characteristics of a novelist are that Powell thought that he lacked. And indeed, he looked for outside of the English tradition, mainly in with the French novelists and the Russians. This does seem to coincide with, or to concur with, the slightly grudging respect that he shared with C.P. Snow. And we have to just sort of surmise this a bit, because unlike Orwell, Powell's great friend, Powell never really committed a full analysis of Dickens' work to print. George Orwell, of course, wrote the very famous essay, 1946, collected here, in which he gave a sort of thoroughly iconoclastic sort of socio-political analysis of Dickens, and really set the bar for sort of 20th century readings of Dickens. So Powell never did that. So what we get instead is a set of asides and sometimes fairly damning critical comments about Dickens. I start with the one that stands out to me, which is about Bleak House, which is arguably one of the great heights of Victorian fiction, in which Dickens sort of does this sort of top to bottom analysis of English society, full of marvelous descriptive poetry and amazing characters, a sort of very complicated plot, and he invents an entirely new genre of detective fiction in Bleak House. And there's so many good things to say about the novel, and all Powell can manage about it after a reading is a lot of good stuff, which seems slightly pathetic. Also, but that is positive compared to what he says about Dombey and Son, which he calls the most clotted rubbish. Parts of Martin Chuzzlewit he calls incredible nonsense. Parts of Our Mutual Friend, unremitting rubbish. One is prepared to accept a certain degree of Dickens' unreality, but this passes all reason. Also, many loose ends are never tied together, significant point. And it's difficult to see why the book is one of Dickens' best known. So even that comment, a lot of good stuff about Bleak House, is followed by a sort of fairly thunderous but. But one is never told who Lady Dedlock was, how she had the affair which resulted in the birth of Esther Summerson, or why Sir Leicester Dedlock never knew anything of it before when he married her. So that might sound like a nitpicking assessment compared to all the goodies in the novel that I've just laid out. But I think it's very significant that Powell is picking out which sort of holes in the scenery of a Dickens novel. You could also call them sort of faults in the circuitry, or you could call them holes beneath the waterline of the novel's sort of integrity. And I think these are very important. It's very important to Powell that Dickens, even a great novel, has such a glaring fault in it. Praise is also qualified for another Dickens summit, Little Dorrit, of which Powell says, Dickens can do exceptional circumstances marvelously well. What he is quite unable to do is depict the ebb and flow of ordinary upper middle class life, or for that matter, working class life, except in the case of the latter, through a thick veil of sentimentality. So that sentimentality is obviously a very major fault in Powell's eyes, and one that he was very keen to avoid. I should say, overall, when we think of Powell and C.P. Snow's objections to Dickens, the thing that probably comes to mind first of all is the treatment of women, of which Dickens was notoriously bad, and as we know, Powell set himself the task, so we don't know, but we assume that Powell set himself the task of rectifying or telling the truth about women, as the painter Rafe Barmby puts it in Dance to the Music of Time. So other Powellian objections to Dickens, and this is another very telling one, I think, about Nicholas Nickleby, when he talks about Squeers, the schoolmaster. He says, however, that Squeers is a great comic character who really comes to life. However, Squeers was primarily a bad man, a contrived villain in Dickens' eyes, rather than a schoolmaster on the wrong educational track. It's the irrational, emotional force that behind the indictment that carries the narrative on so splendidly, not any clarity of thinking. Again, that clarity of thinking, or the lack of it, is very, very significant in the case of Anthony Powell, that insistence on that. But I think what it comes down to is that Powell thought of himself as fundamentally a very different kind of writer from Dickens. And the fact, his comments on Dickens sort of draw this out. There's a quote at the end of To Keep the Ball Rolling, the final volume of Dickens's autobiography, in which he sort of divides writers into perfectionists and imperfectionists. He doesn't use that term, but writers who had the energy and the imagination not to bother too much about sort of loose ends and poor passages, of which he included Dickens and Balzac. Elsewhere he cites Shakespeare, not in that passage actually. And perfectionists, and which he, by implication, includes himself, along with Joyce and Flaubert, who are, what he says, are writers who don't have the energy of the imperfectionists, and therefore they must strive for absolute perfection in their writing. And so I consider this to be one of the most significant things Powell ever said about his own writing, in that the implication is that he felt himself to be in a different class to Dickens and Balzac and Shakespeare in terms of imagination. So he must therefore strive, work and rework the prose to achieve this sort of luminous quality, chastity of style, that is with which we primarily associate him, and in my case love him for. So the conscientious craftsmanship is what he's talking about, and that's what achieves the poise and integrity of a dance to the music of time. Okay, but keeping an eye on the clock, let's just quickly whiz through some of these charges and see how they stack up. So number one, that Dickens was ignorant of daily reality. And this is a charge that Powell comes back to time and time again, saying that he doesn't know how people earn a living. I think it's slightly unfair. I mean, I can see why a lot of it, as Orwell pointed out, nobody in Dickens has a job that they enjoy or seems to enjoy. But actually, I can think of a few exceptions to that. But there are professionals in Dickens's work, and I think of Mr. Bucket in Bleak House, Mr. Tulkinghorn in The Lawyer in Bleak House. Both are supreme professionals, and there are lots of other lawyers in Dickens, lawyers especially, perhaps drawing on Dickens' own experience, who he gives quite a lot of good detail about. Mr. Jaggers in Great Expectations, for example. So I call that one some not proven, as we say in Scotland, one of our verdicts in Scotland. There's also questions about how good Powell himself was about showing how people earn a living. It's perhaps something that you might have thoughts on in the Q&A. Second one, that he behaved badly or gave people a lot to put up with. Not totally clear what he means by that. Obviously, he gave his wife a lot to put up with. In fact, he sort of got rid of her, as you know. Some would say that he gave his mistress, Ellen Ternan, quite a lot to put up with. We don't know. He sort of hid her away, and goodness knows what demands he made on her. She, by the way, told a vicar long after he was dead that she loathed the very thought of his intimacy, which suggests that he gave her quite a bit to put up with. Although, of course, as a Victorian matron talking to a vicar, she would say that, wouldn't she? More substantial, that Dickens was not above cooking the evidence. Now, this seems to me to strike at the heart of Powell's quarrel with Dickens, in that I have an assumption, I sort of infer from reading Powell that he has a sort of rules about telling the truth when making things up, and that you must stick as closely as possible to real life experience and reality while creating fiction. It's obviously paradoxical, but I think that's the case. And there's a couple of instances where he says that Dickens kind of slightly cheated, really, to achieve more sentimental effects. He cites the case of Nicholas Nickleby, where Mrs. Squeers is said to have ripped somebody's boil open with an inky penknife, and the source of this story, this real story, tells a much less sensational version of it. So Dickens sort of jazzed it up. And there's another example in Hard Times, when he talks about the circus folk, and he presents a sort of sepia image of jolly circus people all sort of mucking in together, and Powell tells with great relish the sort of real version of Victorian circus life, told to him by a Victorian circus expert, who says that the Dickens version is rot, and that so Dickens didn't. This is something that Dickens could have got right, but didn't, but chose not to, or chose to. He sort of went for the effect rather than the truth, which I think Powell would consider a bad thing to do. And this is a sort of crime, if it is a crime, of a different order than not being good at depicting women, or painting a picture of a Victorian prostitute like Nancy and Oliver Twist, which is clearly way off the mark. Because that kind of mistake or misrepresentation belongs to a sort of much wider set of issues about depicting women in Victorian society, which was not unique to Dickens, but in terms of researching specific things, getting it wrong seems to be less forgivable to Anthony Powell. Okay, next one, that he was colossally self-righteous, even for a Victorian. I don't really get this one at all. I don't know what you think, but Dickens, nobody who sort of satirized the self-righteous as well as Charles Dickens did could really have suffered from self-righteousness themselves. And George Orwell agrees with me here. He says that Dickens was never a humbug except in minor matters. And I don't think there's really any evidence for that. And it's not the first time that Powell sort of makes an assertion without much evidence, and which reminds me, he sometimes gets things wrong as well, as John Bowen has pointed out in a previous paper for the Society. Okay, next one, that he only excelled at lower middle class characters. Well, he certainly did excel at lower middle class characters. They were his absolute métier, and probably the most famous picture of a lower middle class character in extraordinary circumstances is someone like Mr. Micawber. Bleak House, which I'm slightly focusing on, is full of these fabulous lurid lower middle class characters. Mr. Chadband, Mr. Guppy and his sidekick, going left to right here. The small weeds, the turvy drops. All these characters are fantastic.
I'm not here. Sorry, I got stopped at the upstairs.
The fact that Dickens was bad at aristocrats.
Yeah, well, I guess it's been a lot of
Dickens was bad at aristocrats, and
when Mr. Duncan used to Everyone, sorry.
Yes, yes.
Everyone just empty your glasses into the bucket.
Sorry. I'll just
few glasses in here. Then Shank equals back and score.
that he was bad at aristocrats and he sentimentalized the working class.
Minister,
Colin, sorry,
sit
just somebody's on,
Sorry.
not on mute.
Yeah, I see
We're
that.
hearing a lot of noise.
Sorry, if anybody is not on mute, please mute your microphones. We
Let me
don't
just-
want to hear your private life. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks.
Keith. Okay.
Okay. Sorry, what was that? Yes. So he's bad at aristocrats and sentimentalized the working class. And Bleak House slightly leads me on to a slightly different matter about aristocrats. Bleak House is sort of revolves around the aristocratic couple of Celesta and Lady Dedlock, and on whom the whole melodramatic plot hinges. And I don't think you could call that at all a satisfactory portrayal of an aristocratic couple. Mainly because, well, Celesta Dedlock starts off the novel as one type of character, which is a sort of reactionary local potentate of infinite pomposity, who is in the process of boring his beautiful, socially obscure wife to death from boredom. And at the end of the novel, he's a completely different kind of caricature, which is of a sort of besotted husband forgiving his wife for her past misdeeds. And the two just really don't add up. And it's not really a point about aristocrats, but it's really a point about a sort of lack of integrity in the sort of literal term of wholeness, which I think Powell was very keen to avoid. Okay, going back, and the final one is really about caricatures, not characters. Let's talk about Mr. Skimpole in Bleak House, who is, as many of you will know, really an exact, what Dickens called an exact portrait of a real person, James Leigh Hunt, the poet and essayist, translated, pulled into the novel. Mr. Skimpole, for those of you who don't know, is a sort of one of the great Dickensian villain in a way. He's this aesthete who describes himself an infinite amount of times as a mere child, knows nothing about money, while scrounging off everybody and behaving very dishonorably, and generally being the worst kind of hypocrite, one of the worst in Dickens probably. And I think from Skimpole, I mean, he is an example, possibly the example, the great example of Powell's point, which is he repeatedly goes back to about the difficulty of transferring a real person into fiction, and how it doesn't really work to take somebody, a real life person, and caricature them in a novel, because it sort of pulls the integrity of the novel askew. In the case of Bleak House, Skimpole is supposed to be a friend of Mr. Jarndyce, who is the sort of moral hero of the book in some ways, a man of enormous wisdom and sensitivity, who sort of notices all these sort of slight nuances. But because of the sort of caricatured picture of Mr. Skimpole, we kind of have to assume that Mr. Jarndyce is blind to this character, which slightly makes nonsense of him, and really, in a way, makes nonsense of the novel, I would say. Although obviously there's an awful lot of compensation there as well. So I think that's all I have to say about those charges. The last part of the book So last part of my talk, I want to look a bit more closely at the Bracey Phil Squad comparison and suggest a way of looking at these two characters that I hope will give some idea of different approaches to building character. And of course, novels are all character. I make no apology for choosing two, fairly minor characters from these books. And it so happens, by a very nice coincidence, they have a certain amount in common. Both of them are slavishly loyal servants to their masters. Both of them to military masters. What else? Both of them are very keen on elbow grease. Both of them are illiterate, very unusual in Powell. Both of them are compared to dogs by their creators as well. Neither has a huge amount of relevance to the plot, but they have, they're just wonderful creations, and they are showcases for the very different approaches of their authors to creating characters. And they're tied in with the themes of the novel. Bracey with his funny days, his sort of neurotic episodes that show him to be enthralled to the Furies, his own version of the Furies, which are the theme of the novel, the kindly ones. And Phil Squad exemplifies sort of the rewards of loyalty and perseverance, which are a big theme of Bleak House. And Phil, by the way, is a very good example of Orwell's dictum that a very famous phrase that Dickens's novels are rotten architecture but wonderful gargoyles, and Phil is absolutely the most gargoyle-y character in Dickens, practically, with his long list of. If we look at the sort of the physical description, there's a sort of a list as long as your arm of sort of physical descriptors, and the yellow emphasizes sort of big disparities in the volume of stuff about each character. I won't read it out. It's in my paper, and glad to hear if you think if these are fair comparisons. But this very sparing physical description is to me extremely characteristic of Anthony Powell. All he says about what Bracey looks like, and if you have a vision of him in your head, it's because you have filled in the rest, whereas you haven't been told all this stuff as you are with Dickens. And this is a marvelous Powellian device here. His appearance suggested a fox terrier, a clockwork fox terrier, perhaps. Especially when he arrived on a bicycle. Isn't that brilliant? It's not sort of metaphor plus metaphor, it's sort of simile squared. And it also has the added virtue of being a sort of child's eye view, which is a trick that Powell probably did learn from Dickens, who was a master of sort of seeing things through children's eyes. So physical appearance. As I say, Dickens has a lot more to say on that. Temperament, they've got about the same. Habits and behavior, about the same. Relationships, also the same, well, maybe a little bit more. Archetypal precedent. This is another great Powellian realism enhancer. And sort of, this is a sort of assumed knowledge. It's a great trick. Antagonism between soldier-servant and other males of the establishment was, of course, traditional. Don't you just love that? Of course. Okay, backstory. This is important. Look at all the backstory that Phil Squad gets, and it's a great story. It's a very moving story, if you can totally believe in it, which, of course, I would say one can't entirely. Whereas Bracey, it's much more sparing. and one assumes that one assumes a lot just from what happens in the story, but one isn't told it. Likewise, hearsay, another realism enhancer. Characteristic speech. Again, Dickens is one of the things that people find annoying about him, is that his characters have some habits of speech. Actually, Skimpole is a very good example. He keeps on saying the same phrases again and again. Poles don't really have that, so a big absence there. How they look in others' eyes. This is really the final important one that I want to focus on. The point is that Dickens's characters are not really real to each other, that they are presented, they're sort of held up and presented to us by the sort of Dickens, the impresario, and they do their stuff. They have all the details that Orwell commented on, sort of unnecessary details quite often, and then they're sort of shuffled off, and it's somebody else. Whereas Pole's characters seem to talk about each other and sort of know each other very well, and in some cases they know each other so well, well, that he establishes the trick that they know each other and therefore have their own reality by the fact they can't really remember each other. For example, when Jenkins goes to see the cook Albert 25 years after after Bracy is dead, Albert can barely remember him, and that somehow makes Albert more real. That he's been in the memory and then disappeared from the memory. Okay, and the final thing is how they end up. Dickens, who loves a happy ending, has Phil living an idyllic life in the country, polishing the horse brasses at Chesney Wold, whereas poor old Bracy is no more. All right, Private Bracy is dead. He dies in the retreat from Mons, and that is just mentioned as a sort of aside and not dwelt upon. It's for the reader to dwell upon it. It's for the reader to find the poignancy in the life and death of Bracy, in his unfulfilled love for the parlour-maid Bilson. And this, by the way, is a totally different Private Bracy, but a real one who I'm glad to commemorate, who I just found by chance. So there's an interesting little aside there. Bracy was killed at the retreat from Mons, August to September 1914. So, okay, I'll finish up by saying just a few things in conclusion about what it seems to me that Dickens to Paul was a great teacher, in that he showed it. I mean, in the sort of what not to do stakes, he didn't sort of overwhelm his readers with information and detail, and he left big cracks in the sort of solid masonry of the architecture of a dance to the music of time, and these are the cracks where the reader's imagination goes in. And I think he did learn an awful lot from Dickens, but I haven't really had time to talk about it. I've hinted at some things in the paper, but his charges against Dickens were that whether you are more of a Powellian or a Dickensian, and you can of course be both, but whether you are more of one, it depends how much you care that Celeste Dedlock is sort of one sort of character at the beginning and another character at the end, or that Skimpole's faults are not noticed by other characters, and they're sort of it's like a sort of stage. It's like a stage convention where some characters don't notice other characters. But it seems to me that it creates the world of a Dickens novel is a very different thing in the way that it's directed, what is expected of the reader, and that the reader of Powell is expected to be complicit in the irony of the novel. And that, I think, when I'm looking for reasons for my own sort of 35-year love affair with these novels, it's probably because of that required effort of the imagination that one feels part of this world. And when the reader is more of a collaborator with Powell, and with Dickens, they are more of a sort of dazzled spectator. So thank you very much. That's it.
Thank you, Colin. All very good. Right, question and answer session. Remind everybody to stay on mute, please. If you've got a question or a comment, raise your hand, and I've already got 4 people in the queue. When you are invited to speak, you can either unmute yourself, you can tab mute with alternate A, or press your space bar and hold it down, and you're unmuted all the time you hold the space bar down. Right, Gerald is first in the queue.
Thank you for a great talk. You mentioned at the beginning that Powell used to read Dickens to his children. Do you know which Dickens he was reading?
Yes, I do, because John Powell told me Pickwick Papers. He read the party scenes with some enjoyment, but not much else from Pickwick. Nicholas Nickleby, A Tale of Two Cities, and A Christmas Carol.
Thank you.
Okay. Lance.
Yes, hello. I read Powell, as many people do, through the prism of Proust, and I was trying to see where Proust fits here. He does have characters who change. I mean, the Baron de Charlus is not the same at the end of the novels as he is at the beginning, and he changes frequently. And indeed, Saint-Loup also changes substantially. In fact, everybody in Proust changes a lot, and Proust spends huge paragraphs explaining that that is what happens. I don't mind that in Proust. I do mind it in Dickens. Does Colin think that Powell allows his characters to shift around? I mean, they fail to recognize one another, but do they change in quite that radical way that Proust does? Prousts do.
Yeah. Well, I'm not an expert on Proust at all, but I do think, and if you take someone like Widmerpool, well, who better? For those who don't know, the biggest character. Well, everyone knows that. But yeah, I mean, what a change from a sort of unpopular schoolboy to city slicker to military martinet to Russian spy to Labour peer to crazy hippie, and yet what Powell does that Dickens doesn't do is give a sort of inner through what the narrator Nicholas Jenkins says and what Widmerpool reveals about himself. He allows us to assume, he allows us to understand a sort of inner process in Widmerpool that Dickens doesn't do. And it's partly because he's not writing a first-person narrative novel, although he is in Bleak House, of course, parts of it, and in others you'll know that I don't. But I think he somehow makes what is, on paper sounds absolutely absurd transformation. He makes it real, uh,
So it's for you, it's the inner motivation, which I quite understand. I mean, is that down to the fact that Powell is writing after Freud and after William James, after the invention of psychology, whereas Dickens's sensibility is almost that of Fielding in the 18th century and is well before any notion of psychology? I mean, I suppose I'm not really trying to defend Dickens. I mean, it becomes an absurd sort of game, but you know, Dickens didn't know any psychology, as it were.
No, and given that he didn't know psychology, or psychology didn't exist for him as a discipline, it's amazing how good he was at suggesting motivation and understanding the human psyche. So Mr. Bucket I think is extremely shrewd on. I think he demonstrates a sort of very sophisticated understanding of psychology that obviously Dickens must have shared and must have understood. And it's the same with Esther Summerson in a way, although she's slightly spoiled by being unbearably pie and having lots of other things wrong with her.
Yes. Well, thank you very much, Colin. That was a marvelous talk, and I'm going to see Powell in Dickensian terms, which I do greatly enjoy. And thank you very much indeed.
Well, thank you, Lars.
Thank you. Nick Burns.
Thank you very much, Colin. That was a wonderful talk, and I loved your final point about the reader completing Powell, which I think is profoundly true. In terms of Leigh Hunt and Skimpole, Dickens vehemently rejected the hypothesis that Leigh Hunt was the original, and indeed he wrote very angrily to the New York Times in 1860, seeing it as an American mistake to suppose that, and so that was somewhat Powellian in his animadversions about people who got the character models wrong. So I thought that was just an interesting note to bring in. Just a brief question: do you see more Dickens in Evil and War in the interesting caricature than in the paper?
Yes, I think so. I mean, Evil and War had a much better documented relationship with Dickens. Of course, so his father was a sort of Dickensian Boer of the first water, who and of course there's that passage in A Handful of Dust where someone is condemned to read Dickens forever. So yeah, and there is definitely the caricature. On the Skimpole point, I point to a letter of the 25th of September 1853 when Dickens says of the Skimpole Leigh Hunt comparison, I suppose he is the most exact portrait that was ever painted in words. So I will need to get to the bottom of that, because I can't lay my hands on where I got that quote, but it is about Leigh Hunt and it is about Skimpole. So we'll need to get to the bottom of whether he either was or he wasn't. So I'll leave that with me.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Nick. Paul Graham.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Colin. Excellent talk. Can I raise a couple of issues about class? The criticism of Dickens not being able to draw a gentleman, of course, that was made at the time whilst he was alive, and he was always compared with Thackeray, who could draw a gentleman. I mean, the point was Dickens wasn't a gentleman, and I think it would have been remarkable if he could have portrayed one as well as Thackeray, who was from that class. But I just wonder, do you think Powell's reluctance to admire Dickens stems from the fact that Powell was a conservative? I mean, he was a natural conservative, whereas Dickens, all his life, despite his success and fame, was a radical, and his novels were radical. He was flaying the political, the social, the judicial elite. And I think to Powell, probably that just smacked of self-righteousness and possibly hypocrisy.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Powell makes a catty remark about how Dickens, of course, sent his son to to Eton, despite his supposedly radical views. Actually, he said sons, which is a mistake. He only sent Charlie Dickens Dickens only sent his son Charlie to Eton. That could well be the case. I mean, for Dickens and class, there's a lot more interesting stuff to be said on that subject by George Orwell, and that essay that I referred to is really, I mean, the main beef that Orwell has with Dickens, or whom he loves dearly, as in a way Powell did, I think, was that he doesn't follow through with his sort of attack on the injustices of the age, and that there's a sort of that Dickens missed a great opportunity to be a revolutionary writer. The example that sticks in my head is that Dickens doesn't really object to the fact that little boys have to work in blacking factories. He objects to the fact that sort of nicely brought up little boys like him had to work in a blacking factory. So there's a lot to be. I mean, Dickens' politics is a huge subject. I don't know if Lance has got something to add on that as a Dickensian scholar.
Well, I mean, I'm not going to take your time up, but I have to say that's great. It's a real question, and I mean, George Orwell laid out the ground, and I don't think anybody has ever really gone the other way on that. On the other hand, he's a sentimental, reforming, conservative-minded person rather than a real radical, in my view, because it's for the individuals, and perhaps, as you just indicated, for the middle class more than for the working class.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Lance. Paul. Anybody else? I'll throw two possibly fairly obvious points into the fray. First of all, Colin, you talk about Squad getting, a lot of backstory and some of the other things like that. We mustn't forget that Dickens was writing by the yard. He was writing, most of it was serialized, and he was writing it serialized, having to fill a column to earn a living, basically.
Yeah.
And that was his income. So he is writing by the yard just to fill that column. The second point I make is you comment, I won't say you criticize, but you comment about Powell picking holes, say, in the scenery in Dickens. Well, he would, wouldn't he? Because that's one of the things that Powell was very good at, was the scenery, the background, what's going on, everything that's happening.
Yes, absolutely. And you raised a couple of very good points, Keith. On the picking holes thing, we've got to remember he was a literary professional casting a professional eye over someone else's view, and all you do is find fault. He doesn't waste time saying how marvelous such and such a characterization is. No, so we must remember the context of his criticism. So that's what Powell does, and that's what he does so marvelously. He does it to Shakespeare, for goodness sake, saying that the wooing scene in Henry V is infinitely embarrassing. I mean, I love that about Powell. That the sort of thrill of the sort of lèse-majesté is one of the great pleasures of his critical writing, and you always learn something new. On the serial point, on the writing by the yard point, yes, absolutely. That Dickens is doing his high wire act of unfolding. In the case of Bleak House, there's a multi-plotted, multi-stranded, multi-toned beast, and he's sort of laying it out in monthly episodes. So it's quite an astonishing feat, and I feel it's a bit cheap of me to talk about inconsistencies, and because goodness knows, I mean, before computers, even. I mean, how anyone could do that. And so, yeah, it's a high wire act. And so one shouldn't, I do offer with some humility the criticism that it's not somehow perfectly integral. Of course, Powell was also doing a high wire act, except that his episodes came out in biannual episodes. So he knew a bit about the perils of serialization and inability to go back and revise. But no, it's a very good point. And Dickens, everything I've said, and I think everything that Powell said, should be taken in the context of sort of awed respect for what Dickens managed to achieve and how he managed to revolutionize, reading in around the world, not just in the UK.
Interesting that you make the point about inconsistencies, writing a series, or writing episodic. Powell didn't have the advantages of computerization either, and yet we know he did keep some notes. There are sheets at Eton, I mean, on the back of other things, where he scribbled bits of family trees for his characters and so on. Something I need to do some work on. I mean, I've got copies of it. So yeah, I mean, Powell did that. Now, whether Dickens did or not, I don't know, and I don't know whether anybody knows. I mean, they may well do, but yeah, interesting. John Trotter.
Thank you, Keith, and thank you, Colin, for your talk. As often happens, as I raised my hand, Keith, you made more or less the point I was going to make. but it always strikes me that not only is there the point about writing by the yard, but the point that Colin has gone on to explore in the last few minutes, that you can't go back to chapter 1 and chapter 2 as Powell presumably did in his books. And we know he revised a lot, but the first chapters are out there and they're gone. So not only are you thinking, well, how am I going to end this book, or what's going to happen next, but you're stuck with what's gone before. And that point about consistency, I think, is a very important one. And I wondered if Powell himself had made any allowance, as it were, about that when he was critical of Dickens. Does he make any comment about that, Colin, that you found?
No, not that I've found. He's I mean, that list of so-called charges was really, there isn't a list of 6 great things about Dickens to go with that. That would certainly be one.
Yeah.
I mean, what Powell did do is that when he started writing a volume, he went back and read all the preceding ones. Yeah. And he actually says somewhere I can't remember, it's in the journals or in his memoirs, that he actually did that for every single volume. He went back and reread everything he'd written before in Dance. So yeah, I mean, I guess there's no reason why Dickens couldn't have done it if he I mean, he must surely have kept copies of what was published.
Can I just say, Keith, that Dickens did actually start planning his novels from Dombey and Son onwards.
Right.
So there is proof that he actually did make notes and did plan, but only from Dombey. And the most sort of egregious example of him having to change what he was writing in serial was in David Copperfield, when he introduced a character called Miss Moucher, who was a dwarfish chiropodist, amongst other things, and she was quite an evil, quite a sort of sinister character. And the lady called Mrs. Seymour Hill, who read that part, recognized herself in the portrait and wrote a letter demanding that Dickens apologize. And so when Miss Moucher appeared many issues later in the novel, she had a complete personality transplant, and she was a paragon of virtue.
Excellent. Thanks, Paul. Noreen next.
Okay, pure speculation, but AP famously, I think, didn't really enjoy Hollywood. Fair enough. Do we think Dickens would have hacked it any better? would he have been a natural, as I always think Wagner would have been, a natural translation to the Hollywood environment?
I think absolutely he would. And I think another of the great things about Bleak House is it seems to be extremely cinematic, sort of sweeping, panning lens. So yeah, no, Noreen, I think that's exactly, that would be a medium that he would love. And of course, it has all kinds of melodramatic and the lurid things you can do in film that he would love to have done.
You're on mute. Well, you are.
You inviting me, Keith?
No, he's telling me I'm on mute. Any better?
Yep.
Good. Yeah, I mean, one immediately thinks of the David Lean films of Dickens, particularly Oliver Twist. You know, how much Dickens surely would have enjoyed. He might not have. It's not necessarily good to be on the set when your written work is being turned into a film, but I think those were very, very memorable films, whether you like the books or not.
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, one of the points that Powell makes is that Dickens quarreled a lot with his illustrators and as well as his typesetters, but his illustrators mainly, and probably because he didn't he didn't agree with their depictions. And actually you can see why in this are you seeing this with this picture of Phil Squad. Dickens says quite clearly more than once that this character has only one eyebrow, whereas Fizz shows him very clearly with two eyebrows. So that is the sort of thing that would have annoyed him. So I can imagine it would be quite a lot for him to get annoyed about with a Hollywood version.
Lord, yes.
and yet Powell absolutely loved the Mark Boxer cartoons. By contrast, I mean, to the extent that he owned some, I don't know how many, certainly more, I think more than one. Yeah. Okay, Paul.
Yes, thanks, Keith. Well done, Colin. A very interesting talk. Just make an observation and then lead on to one last point, which is that and Michael Henley's made this point as well. I mean, Dickens was an actor, of course, and so I think it's remarkable that two people as different as Dickens and AP, where AP said he had no histrionic talent whatsoever, if you recall. Yet AP ranked him second only to Shakespeare in English writers. So I think that says two things. One about basically what Dickens brought to the novel, which AP recognised, and also AP not being a sort of a censorious character. AP had a broad view and could see the merits in writers who would be temperamentally very different to himself. I think one thing that you didn't mention, one novel you didn't mention, Colin, was David Copperfield. Now, if we think that Dance is basically a fictionalised version, plus or minus, of AP's life, then of course David Copperfield is a fictionalized version, certainly a part of Dickens' life. It will be interesting to compare the approaches of the two writers to revisiting their past and writing about it. I don't know whether you have any comment on that.
Yes, I mean, I think David Copperfield and Great Expectations are the two great Dickensian autobiographies of childhood, and I certainly think that Powell had them in mind as another sort of negative example when writing The Kindly Ones, which everyone will know starts off with the only sort of childhood reminiscence in The Dance to the Music of Time, and I think that there's apart from sort of not having any or depicting the sort of working class characters and servants notably differently from how Dickens does it, there's a lack of sort of childhood self-pity that I think is sort of bouncing off Dickens, who obviously goes in for self-pity quite a lot. You could say he had a lot to be self-pitying about, which is true. So yes, and there are echoes of I do see echoes. I refer to it in the paper of a sort of Dickensian whimsy in his description of Stonyhurst as well. So, Paul, what was your first point? Again, your observation.
Well, the observation that it's remarkable that AP actually enjoyed Dickens and ranked him second only to Shakespeare.
Yeah.
When the two are so different in terms of Dickens being the showman and the actor, and AP being the complete opposite.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, there's two things to say about that. One is that being top of the tree among English novelists in Anthony Powell's views is not actually such a great distinction because he didn't. His models were, as I said, French, the Russians, and others, like Musil people, and so I don't think it's. I think it's just he likes everybody else less than Dickens, rather than probably. But I mean, there's definitely the element of that. So the folk memory that Dickens invokes is a phrase that Powell uses, and I think that was very important to Powell. He probably read it in his own childhood, and I think annoyingly he doesn't say that, but I'm guessing that he was sort of deeply ingrained with the with the whole. It seeped to the sort of cult of Dickens was sort of in with the bricks with Powell, and he had to react against that. Yeah, and the thespian point. Yes, I mean, I think one of the things that Dickens gave people to put up with was constantly forcing them into jolly histrionics and fun and games, but they was all very well meant, and this is an outlet for Dickensian energy.
Okay, thanks, Colin. Thanks, Colin. Keith, have we got anybody else's hand up or not?
Not that I know. Anybody want to contribute anything else?
Okay, we've gone an hour and 15 minutes. So shall I wrap it up there and just say on behalf of everybody that's still on the call, to say big thank you to Colin for a very entertaining and enjoyable talk, and thanks to everybody for joining and participating. And our next talk will be on April the 20th. My diary is correct. So when we're hoping that Stephen Hall will talk to us on London Clubland, including the Travellers, which of course was AP's club. But there'll be more on that on the website in the next few days. So thanks again to Colin and to everybody for joining, and thanks to Keith for hosting.
Yep.
So
thanks, everybody.
Thanks everyone for tuning in.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.